Perfect. Well, welcome to the first Midwest Strength Performance in-house coaching seminar. Hopefully we'll have many more of these, but we would like to welcome you all. We thank you all. You guys are the reason why MSB is the greatest, best gym in the world. Excited for us all to further our knowledge with one another today. Starting out real quick. So this seminar is going to be based off of the scientific principles of strength training, written by Chad Wesley Smith, Dr. Mike Israetel, Dr. Trevor Hoffman. It's a book that's had a huge impact, I know, on JT and myself, and I think a lot of us here. Again, these guys are not gods. This isn't doctrinal truth, but these principles, we believe, are very evidence-based. They come out of logic and reason. They're not random, and they can influence the way that we program for any individual within any goal. And for that, they're extremely helpful. Who here has read the book? There we go. So we got, nice. So did everyone read it?
I haven't read it.
Perfect.
I skimmed through it.
Skimmed through it?
I think Zane sent me like the giant PDF.
Yes.
Yeah,
So,
I have the giant.
but I have not read through it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so this will be nice. This will probably be a rehash for a lot of people, pretty much everyone here. Any questions that people have during the duration of this discussion, feel free to ask, add in, argue. This is extremely informal. All right, so anyways, as you can see here, we have all the principles listed by JT. They're listed in order of importance. Essentially, if you get the first three principles right, you will be the best coach in the area, best coach probably in Illinois. The other principles are important, especially for more advanced trainees, but the first three are the ones that we're probably gonna spend most of the time on. So anyways, the first principle, being the most important, is specificity. So when a member comes in, an athlete comes in, they're paying for one thing. They're paying for results. They're paying for the outcomes of which they are seeking. And of course, we want to make it an enjoyable process along the way. Well, specificity is what takes into account our client's goals, and it makes our client's goals our goals. When we're training people, we constantly want to remind them of the goals that they have. It's a sales tactic that I know Andy will get into as far as increasing longevity of the client. But our client's goals, those are our goals with that individual. So what specificity says, and this branches into all the other categories, essentially, whatever outcome the individual wants to get, the movements that are selected, the loads intensity are selected, should get them there. So if you want to become a great squatter, you should squat. If you want to become a great bencher, you should bench. If you want to become a great deadlift, if you want to become a great swimmer, you should swim. A great runner, you should run. Anything else that you do outside of specificity, if it's not helping you towards the outcomes you want to have, it violates it and it takes away from program design. This is something that we commonly see within programs where there could be a couple elements that are directly related to the client's goals, but then there could also be a lot of other stuff in there that does not bring them closer to their goals, and we'll call that junk volume, and that is dangerous.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
So what he's talking about right now is a sub-principle of specificity. That's called training modality compatibility. Okay, so what that means is like if you want to be like, let's say, a bodybuilder, you would want to prioritize hypertrophy training versus training like maybe like marathon running, because those two training modalities conflict too much to be happening at the same time. So it's a pretty obvious thing, but I think it's just worth mentioning that you have limited resources with what you can put towards training. So you want to keep that in mind when you're programming for clients. A lot of times clients will have conflicting goals, so you want to make sure you get a clear picture of what they want to prioritize.
Correct. A clear picture of what they want to prioritize in their timetable. And it's okay. Most of the people we coach will have multiple goals. I'm sure a lot of people we coach, they want to be stronger. They also want to be great at running. So explaining the compatibility model to them is important. It's kind of weighing what is most important and spending most of their volume there. You can be a great runner and power lifter, but each will kind of take away from the other. So for example, with an advanced trainee, it's gonna be hard for them to be very successful at both simultaneously. So let's say they have a powerlifting meet coming up. You may put their running on maintenance volume so they can keep the skill, and then they'll put more of their resources, their training volume into their powerlifting. They have a marathon coming up. Maybe you put their strength training on maintenance. That way they can maintain the skill. There's still some specificity allocated towards that, but they're able to focus on the running. It's similar, I believe the book touches on this. If you're looking to learn 3 languages at once,
Yeah, that is the
so yeah, Monday, Spanish, Wednesday, French, Friday, German, you're probably not gonna learn any of the languages very well. So specificity is gonna end up going the progressive overload, where we need to have that stacking effect. And anything else that you're building within your tower, so to speak, even though it can be nice, it's gonna take away from your budget as far as getting you to the peak outcome of whatever you want to accomplish.
Yeah.
You'll find with your clients too that they may have specific goals starting out, but one of the things that I think is very important during the duration of training clients one-on-one or in small groups is listening to them. Listening to the outcomes of which they are seeking, because goals do change, and that's okay. So make sure, like when a client's goal changes, and maybe the specificity of that goal changes, do it in an intelligent way where you explain, we'll start maybe focusing on that in the next block, and these are things that we're gonna have to tweak within your programming, and this is what you can expect. Cool. Anything else that you would like to add for specificity?
He touched on one thing, which where Mike was talking about stacking training, and that's referred to as directed adaptation. So this is going to go right into overload, which is the next principle we're going to talk about. Directed adaptation just means that like you're sequencing your programming, so you're not like adding a ton of variation or changing things week to week. Each week builds on the next. This is again going to go into overload, but at the beginning of a training block, you want to start out with like, let's say 4 to 5 reps in reserve, and then you continually lower that number till you're at 0 to 1 reps in reserve, and then you deload, and then it starts over again. So it stacks, and you build on that, and then you deload, and then you move on to the next training block. That's called directed adaptation. That's another part of specificity, but it'll also go into overload.
Yeah, and then how you're overloading is going to be dependent back with specificity. So like JT talked about, if you have a client that's looking to mostly accrue lean tissue, you're probably going to overload them with a more hypertrophic rep range, somewhere between 6 to 30 reps per working set. That's going to be variant depending on movement as well. Most likely you're not going to have clients doing 30 rep deadlifts. It's not going to build their 1 rep deadlift strength much, which is why most people would probably do deadlifts. And 2, axial system will probably fatigue before the target muscles that you're trying to potentially hypertrophy, being maybe the hamstrings and glutes and quads. So rep ranges of which you're overloading in will be dependent on the movement, and then we'll get into that later in other chapters as well, as that's going to touch within individualization as well as variation. If you're aiming for maximal strength, you're probably going to be more so aiming to increase load that they're lifting on a week-by-week basis. Brad Schoenfeld just published a really cool study looking at ways to accrue hypertrophy. A combination of increasing weight, reps, number of sets, all seems to be pretty equal and beneficial in doing so. So, yeah. What else would you like to add to overload?
That's pretty much it. I think you can overload a lot of different ways, but the easiest way is just increased mechanical tension over time. And then, you can get, within overload, you could talk about like Mike kind of already touched on this, but hypertrophy or strength building could look a little bit different. There's a lot of ways to progress hypertrophy. But yeah, basically just increase mechanical tension over time and, or adding sets, reps, or weight over time.
Yeah, so you're trying to increase force output over time. The easiest way to do that is for athletes to be training on stable surfaces using movements that they can progressively overload. Go for it.
It's also important that people are training close to their threshold every session. So like you can't like continually train at 4 to 5 RIR for like indefinitely because you're never going to make progress. So people have to like push themselves.
Yeah, so week 2 might be 3 RIR, week 3, 2 RIR. if you get too far away from failure, that's not gonna be enough stimulus to create adaptation.
Yeah.
And then another key principle as well, this is oftentimes seen within maybe some of the high schoolers we're working with. Week 1, they want to start at 1 RIR or 0 RIR, they go failure. Now the issue with this is they're gonna probably start too close to their maximal recoverable volume.
Yeah.
So there's gonna be less of a wave that they can progress over that duration of time. Typically, most individuals do best if you can set up their increases so that the block lasts somewhere between 4 to 8 weeks. Now, some individuals, it may last longer. Those could be newbies. Maybe they're only training with you once or twice per week. The 1 to time per week trainees, they might be able to progress for 12 weeks. Essentially, if the movement's able to be progressed in weight or load, keep on doing it. Keep on going. Keep on building. But again, don't start too hard that you're not able to ride that adaptive wave. So you have your minimal effective volume. You want to start there. For most individuals, that'll probably be around 8 to 10 working sets per muscle group per week. And then over time, you could probably build up to about 20 working sets. That's going to be depending on what else you're doing within the program, what exercises are selected, things that could conflict with one another, what type of modalities that they're trying to combine simultaneously. So there's a myriad of variables that are going to affect that minimal effective dose as well as that maximal recoverable and how you fit it into a puzzle. But simply put, doing more over time, don't start too hard. It's better to start more conservative week 1. Another component of overload, and this is why it's so important, is as you overload, you're gonna make neural adaptations. You're literally giving your body time to develop the skill. If you continually change the exercises, the reps, your body's not able to adapt, and you're not going to be as efficient. It goes back to specificity with the foreign language analogy.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Mm-hmm.
Could you give me like an example?
Yeah, so for example, if you bench press week 1, week 2 you do dumbbell bench, week 3 you do push-ups, you essentially will leave there with nothing. You'll have fun, you might build some tension in your chest, it might be cool, I mean, and we all have seen it. You'll see people go to the gym, you're like, what are you training? It's like, well, my bros are training this, so I'm hopping in. Nothing wrong with that. Exercise is good for our health, and any type of exercise is better than zero. But it takes several weeks to make neural adaptations where you actually become efficient and you're able to recruit more muscle. So if you're not efficient with the movement, you're going to recruit less tissue, and then because of that, you're going to get less growth. And again, it takes about 3 weeks, and this depends on the movement as well. Some movements you're able to make very quick neural adaptations, such as single joint movements, like a bicep curl, whereas for maybe a squat, you may want to keep a squat several blocks in a row just because there are so many systems at play that those neural adaptations may take a little bit longer. So,
If you ever get pushback, sometimes people will want to change week to week. You can just explain to him that this is the optimal way and the most efficient way, the fastest way to get results is to do it in this way.
and another thing that you can do is think about the things that are really driving them towards their goals. Make sure you use specificity, progressive overload with those. Maybe if some people like to entertain themselves and that's how they stick with it, you can have more variation in some of the single joint accessories,
Right.
later. Again, it wouldn't be optimal, but again, if the athlete is not training, they quit, that's even less optimal for them and for you. So obviously work with the athlete. We are not dictators, but try to keep some semblance, at least specificity and overload with the main things they want to be great at. I know some of the coaches here, we've all worked with people that want some variation with the other stuff.
Yeah.
Eventually those people do come around once they kind of see the proof via experimenting the success for themselves of specificity and overload, but we are working with humans.
Right.
Like mechanically similar movements is a good way to look at that, right?
Yeah.
Throwing like an MSM in every workout. I know that's something that if they're wanting variation, like from a bench press, throw in something like that to like keep them guessing. I don't know, that's just something that I've seen. And be a little bit effective, but then like you said, they end up figuring out that like you bench press more over time, your bench press is stronger.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, maybe like you could have one of their auxiliary or accessory presses
Yeah.
be slightly variant. That works. Now, overload is also going to be affected depending on the phase of dieting that they're in. So we're also discuss nutrition with our athletes. If an athlete is cutting, they're in a caloric deficit. They may overload at a slower pace. If they're in extreme deficit, maybe the goal is more so to repeat performance. If an athlete loses 10, 15 pounds during the block of training and they didn't lose any strength, as far as strength in the barbell is concerned, they actually probably gain strength, they probably gain muscle. Now the reason for this is their leverages are off, so that makes that neural component tougher because it's harder to build efficiency in the movement. But two, they're probably lifting the weight more far. So for example, if an athlete benches 300 pounds for 10, at 250 pounds, at the end of the block they do 300 for 10, at 235, 40 pounds, they're lifting the weight probably an extra inch or so because they're losing tissue here and back here. They're literally getting smaller. So if they can keep that performance, they're lifting further duration, they are stronger, and they probably have more muscle. The more adipose, to an extent, that an individual has, that provides cushion and surrounds the joints, allowing for that rebound effect on a lot of lifts, which may reveal some type of fitness level as far as a numerical, quantitative measurement way of looking at it. But the reality is, if they can do the same output without relying on tissue and leverages, they probably are stronger and added muscle. But simply put, if they're dieting, they're in a deficit, their wave or their realm as far as minimal effective to maximal recoverable volume, that's going to shrink. Generally speaking, individuals that are in a deficit, their minimal effective volume is actually going to be higher. They're going to need a little bit more training volume at the beginning. Training increases muscle protein synthesis, which is important for muscular retention when you're in a catabolic state. And then their maximal recoverable is not going to be as high either. So that's going to, again, influence that rate of
Want
gain.
to talk about volume real quick? I'll put those up there.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, we should probably talk about that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, and then if they're bulking, their minimal effective volume that they can start at is going to be lower. They're not going to need as much to grow, but they're going to be able to progress to a higher maximal recoverable dose, meaning you might be able to increase the reps more per week. You might be able to increase the intensity. Intensity means weight per week. You could probably increase the volume more per week.
What is it? MV, MEV, MRV?
Yep. And then there's the adaptive volume, which is kind of in the center, and that's a moving target. The volume that you can handle generally increases in some capacity as you adapt to the training. MRV. Yeah. And then the way we define volume is number of hard sets, number of working sets. So for example, a hard set of 6, when it comes to hypertrophy, is probably gonna be equal to a hard set of 15. Each one of those reps during the hard set of 6 is gonna be much more stimulatory than each rep of the set of 15, but you're just doing a lot more reps when you're doing 15. So at the end of the day, it probably is gonna equal out. So that's why we just say number of hard sets.
So maybe max.
Adaptive.
Yeah. This is max.
So the MAV, the adaptive volume, that's the number that we're trying to hit during each individual microcycle, aka each individual training day. That number is going to increase more slowly during a cut. It's going to increase maybe a little bit more quickly during a mass. That number is also going to be influenced based on the lifestyle of the athlete, how much sleep they're getting, their training history, if they've been training for a long time versus not training very long. It's going to be affected based on movements that you're utilizing. For example, a squat set's going to be probably twice as fatiguing as a leg extension set, but it's also going to be twice as stimulatory. So when you're thinking about working sets, there's different ways to kind of like think of it logically. Some people like to think of a squat set or a compound movement that's challenging as 2 working sets, or you could count like the leg extension set as a half a set. There's that. And then the height of the athlete too is going to affect that volume. The taller the athlete, the less volume they're going to be able to handle as they progress because they're literally lifting the weight a lot further. A super strong person, their volume may not be as high because if they're squatting 800 pounds, even though they're equipped to squat 800 pounds is still 800 pounds. It's a lot harder on their tendons and joints, just that sheer force. Their frequency is going to affect overload. 2, if they're training more often, you may not want to overload as aggressively because they may still be recovering from a prior session. We'll be touching on that in fatigue management.
How do you know when you've hit each one of these?
Great question. We're going to get into that in fatigue management, but I'll answer that right now. I guess we're kind of segueing there.
Yeah.
So you know that you've hit your maximal recoverable volume. We'll start there. That one's pretty easy when a couple things happen. You know you need a deload when. That's how I like to think of it. You didn't progress your weights or reps or sets in subsequent workouts. So maybe 2 to 3 workouts in a row, you kind of maintained, you were stagnant or you decreased. Number 2, your pumps suck. You just feel it in your joints. You're not getting that like skin splitting muscular burst. So that's a sign. Number 3, psychologically, you just don't have the desire to train. You're like, training sucks. I don't want to do this. I want to go home and cry, call my like parents and loved ones and tell them that I'm not well. That's a sign. Another sign would be you're getting sick. Your immune system decreases as systemic fatigue is accrued, which happens during the duration of a hard training block. 5, your appetite sucks. Really hard training suppresses ghrelin, and ghrelin is the growl hormone, so to speak. That's how you think of it, GG. So ghrelin makes you hungry. So if you're chronically training very, very hard, sometimes you may notice a huge dip in appetite. Another sign that you may need a deload, be careful with discussing this with the athletes that you coach. If it's a man-on-man circumstance or like a relationship where there's trust and it's just you do it in a very scientific way. Libido typically decreases a fair amount when you're at the end of a block, or at least noticeable. Some people are like, oh, I don't have that problem, but okay, Kale.
We gotta cut that out.
It's all right. Yeah.
I'll touch on this later.
Yeah. So those are signs that you need a deload.
Yeah. I think it's important to consider what this sounds like coming from like a client, right? Because like
Yeah.
sometimes, actually a lot of times, people will say like, "Oh, I'm fine. Like I feel great, whatever," and they'll like want to continue to push training, and then like you're kind of dancing with like the risk of injury, and you have to be cautious of that. So for me, like particularly with like the Gen Pop people that maybe are not like as don't have as much capacity. I will usually err on the side of caution with the deload, and you're probably better off taking a deload if you know you've like completed the training block and it was like relatively hard. You've written their program for them. You the coach, you know when like they should need a deload. So even if they're saying they don't, I would usually just give them a deload and then explain to them why, and explain to them that we're going to talk about this in the fourth principle of SRA, but we'll explain that. But also like don't be afraid to like ask them questions to like elicit like if these things are going on that Mike just outlined, like, because sometimes people are not going to like share that right off the bat. And so ask them like how their training's going, how they feel psychologically, physically, how their sleep is, how their appetite is, how their libido is. And then you can kind of like derive that information from them and make a choice. But generally speaking, me personally, and I think Mike will agree with me here, I usually program like a block of like 4 to 6 weeks of hard training and then a deload. Usually I do 4 weeks and then a 5th week deload. So you kind of know where they should be deloading already just based on the programming. And then also you can like double check by asking them the questions and see.
Yeah, again, very advanced trainees, they may need deloads more frequently. And then the training adaptations of which they're seeking to will warrant how many weeks they go before a deload. If they're bodybuilding, they're probably doing less fatiguing movements, more direct stimulus to the musculature that they're working. Those blocks might be able to be a little bit elongated compared to like a power lifter who's looking for like a maximal load on squat, bench, deadlift within each phase even. They may have to deload more frequently. But yeah, listen to your client. It's better to be conservative. There is a term called functional overreaching, and this is more debated within the literature, where you exceed your maximal recoverable for a really short duration, like they feel like crap, but you just get it done anyways. You have to be really careful. And then when you deload, you get a super compensatory effect, like a slingshot, where they might be able to get to an even higher level. But that is more disputed and very risky because of the chance of injury, but also the psychological aspect too. People do not like training when they are at their MRV or higher, so the risk of them like quitting probably would go up too. It's better to deload earlier than later. If it's week 2 of a training block and some of those things that we listed are happening, I would also try to find out what is generating the fatigue. If it was they just like had a ton of weekend lifestyle fatigue, like party, Ibiza,
That's a good point.
then I might say, okay, get a good night of sleep, and we'll go back to your minimal effective volume for week 3, and we'll try to get some overload going. Maybe they drank a ton one night. They're super hungover. That may decrease the volume for that individual day, but then you can get back to their normally scheduled volume for subsequent days as they have their Taco Bell and their body is ready to handle it. Or like maybe like they had something horrible in their life just happen. Like there's a lot of things that can generate fatigue that maybe aren't due to the training itself, but to lifestyle, and depending on where that falls within the block. If it falls like week 4 and you want to go 5 weeks, maybe you deload a week early. But if it's really early in the block, you might want to like find ways to manage those fatigue markers, help them readjust for a training session or 2, and then get back to the normally scheduled routine. So systems that are fatigued, I think oftentimes the word fatigue gets thrown out, and people within our industry have a million different definitions. Like for example, you've probably heard people say, my central nervous system is fried. It is fried. It's like the people at Cane's that just like leave the burners like for hours and hours, like torched, unedible, sucks. CNS fatigue is more so, Dr. Andy Galpin has done a fair amount of research on this. It's in our head. So CNS fatigue dissipates within 20 minutes of a hard training session. Again, these are just like words, but if you want to discuss them with your client, sometimes they enjoy it. The types of fatigues that really have been shown in literature are your peripheral nervous system fatigue, CNS glial cells or your messenger cells. The fatigue that most of us probably notice the most are tissue fatigue. So think your tendons, your ligaments, your bones, your muscles, everything hurts. This is due to just like extreme damage, ripping of the muscle and the blunt force that's put on that. And there's different ways to kind of fight against these fatigues. So the way a deload is great, because the deload helps fight against the tissue fatigue. It allows for joint recovery. It allows your body to replenish glycogen stores. So during a deload week, this is actually very important. This is very applicable. I feel like maybe 80% of the people we're coaching are cutting at any given period. Most people that come to the gym, they're looking to lose weight, right? Well, during a deload week, it's counterintuitive to stay in a caloric deficit, as the goal of the deload is to recover, replenish those glycogen levels. So when you're discussing with your client, okay, we're doing a deload week, they may say, oh my gosh, I'm not training at all. Does that mean I should eat less? Absolutely not. Because then they're gonna go into the next training block feeling like crap, they're not gonna be able to train as hard, and they're gonna lose all their muscle, they're gonna be really sad, their friends aren't gonna love them anymore. So instead, tell them maintenance calories, you're not gonna gain any weight. If you do, it'll probably be like 2 pounds of water, because glycogen, carbohydrates, water, sodium, potassium, refueling the tissue. This is good. Your pumps are gonna be great when you come back. You're gonna feel really, really strong, and you're gonna be happy, and your friends are gonna love you. So tell them maintenance calories if they're in a deficit. You could probably also go maintenance or a little bit above if they're in a surplus in bulking. Again, the number 1 goal of a deload is recover. And then number 2, the other question sometimes arises is, well, why did I do anything? Like, this deload is so easy. What's the point of this? As we talked about with specificity, everything we do is a skill, and that requires neural adaptations. You do the deload because you want to keep those skills that you've been working on for the previous 4 to 6 weeks. If you just do nothing, which is okay, it's better than not deloading, you risk losing the skills, and you kind of push yourself back a little bit going into the next block. Let's see here. Other ways to manage fatigue, we talked about it a little bit, but like light days, let's say they had a horrible weekend, things were crazy, maybe you go a little bit lighter that day. Obviously, super obvious, program rest days, days where they're not training. That's the best way to recover. Oftentimes athletes will be like, what more can I do to recover? And they want to buy the latest and greatest supplement. I mean, unless it's steroids, like it's probably not going to do that much. I usually recommend get some sleep. Other things that they can do is go on a leisurely walk. Do things that are low impact, getting the body moving, getting some movement. That can also help to facilitate recovery by funneling nutrients and blood to your tissue that need it for recovery. Other mistakes people make during a deload, they start doing a bunch of random crap. Now the issue with doing random crap is more fatiguing. You probably remember the first time you did your first leg day. You probably felt really sore for another week or two. You thought, this is my life now, this is COVID. Don't do random stuff during the deload, and that's again why specificity, going back to that, is so important. When we do random stuff, that generates a lot of fatigue, and that fatigue is not worth the stimulus of which it's providing. People want to feel sore, they think that's great. Soreness is correlated with muscle growth, but it's not a causer. At the end of the day, it's mechanical tension increase over time that does that. Soreness is a byproduct of hard training. Sometimes you won't be sore, and that's fine. I prefer not to be sore, but I'm not David Goggins.
True.
Yeah.
Or Ron.
Or Ron. Yeah. Anything else that you would like to touch on in fatigue management?
Well, let's talk about programming a deload week.
Yes.
And what that looks like.
Yes.
I'll just kind of explain how I do it. I actually do it two different ways, but the main way I do it is, so I'll just, usually I will kind of repeat their last hard week of training, but I'll reduce intensity and volume or whatever it is by about 50%. And that's kind of like their deload. You could also do it another way. This is maybe less efficient. Sometimes, depending on the athlete or the client, I will start the next training block with the deload, depending on how different the training looks from one block to another. If it's similar, I'll just maybe there's a few different accessory movements. I'll actually just start week one of the training block as their deload, because the intensity with RIR is so low, right? 4 to 5 RIR, and the volume is low. It can work that way too, as long as there's not like a crazy amount of variation between the two blocks, which there really shouldn't be. But the main way I do it is just like a 50% reduction in intensity or volume.
Yeah. And just like volume seems to be the driver of muscular hypertrophy, volume is also very fatiguing. So make sure you're doing less.
Yeah.
But yeah, like what you said there, like if you're training a client once or twice a week, you may not want to do like the full deload.
Exactly.
So just transitioning it to the next block.
That's what exactly.
Yeah, with like something, maybe maintenance volume.
Yeah, maintenance volume, and so yeah.
Yeah.
So if it's somebody who's training really hard for like 4 times a week, and it's a hypertrophy training or powerlifting or whatever, strength training, then I'll just literally like cut the previous week in half, pretty much.
Mhm.
Like 50%.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it's substantial.
Yeah.
And then
if they're training
Client will
hard.
notice this a lot.
Yeah. And then what I like to do as far as like a practical standpoint during that deload day, so we're still adding value to the client as well, talk about their goals, reconnect on that, and then talk about like what you think they should expect going into the next block, and then how the next block is going to be building off of the previous. Give them a seminar on the scientific principles of strength training.
Yeah.
Other thing to really consider during a deload when they're executing, I recommend this, decreasing stimulants that week.
Yeah.
So resensitizing. Again, when you're at the end of a hard training block, sometimes your sleep quality is going to suck. We're trying to reduce cortisol levels with the deload and also get our testosterone back to maybe normal ranges. Really, really hard training does decrease testosterone temporarily, which may not feel very nice. So yeah, try to get them off of stimulants and then manage arousal too. So I tell them like other great things during the deload is affectionate touching with like a willing, consenting party, whether that's like hugging your mom or other things. But yeah, things that just like make you relaxed and happy. Go watch a comedic movie. Don't listen to Rick Ross. So something that I'll do with some of my clients is we'll listen to like Beethoven or Mozart. They're like, Mike, what the heck are you doing? And I said, look, I'm trying to keep your arousal low. We're trying to recover. really practicing perfect technique, use that as an opportunity to, again, kind of keep those neural adaptations that they made throughout the block. Training is one of those things where if you don't use it, you lose it, so we don't want to lose any type of mobility either. But keep it very calm, keep it chill, encourage them to not work too hard.
Yeah, I think a deload's a good chance for like a scan and diet talk, right?
Yes.
Like, yeah, so if it's every 6 or 4 weeks, it's a good time for that usually.
Yes, that's a great point, Zane. What we like to do is have our athletes start the training session with a scan then, and then once you're like on the second or third exercise, the scan is up, you pull up on your phone, and we discuss it, and then based on those like objectives, circumference measurements at least, they can kind of like maybe think about where we want to allocate volume in a way that logically makes sense playing off of the previous block. And then yeah, it's nice kind of like rehashing the previous block. What went right, what went wrong, what can we change, both in the gym and things that we can do to help them, serve them so that they can change themselves outside of the gym. Yeah, sweet. Any other things you want to touch on fatigue management?
No, I think we're good there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Stimulus, recovery, adaptation. So essentially, stimulus, recovery, adaptation, these are what affects frequency. Do you want to draw the graph? Perfect. So this is something that I like to draw when discussing program design in the initial consultation with a member that's coming in. They're going to oftentimes ask, how often should I train? How often should I do that? Very well thought out, reasonable questions. No, the x-axis is time. And then the y-axis is fitness. Fitness just stands for strength, capacity, endurance, whatever adaptations they're seeking. So this goes, it goes boom, boom. So they always start at 0, 0. Yeah. Yep.
It goes here and then goes down.
No. It goes down.
Down here. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Here stimulus.
Yeah. It'd be,
Over time and then this way, right?
yep.
And then up again.
Yeah. All the way up. Cool. Then it goes again. So different muscle groups, different exercises are going to have different SRA curves. So when you train a muscle, every time you train it, hopefully it's at 0, 0. It's ready to be trained. It's ready to be played with. When you train for a couple days after, you'll probably notice that you're a little bit weaker. So you go below the y-axis. Your strength level actually decreases. That's okay. That's not a bad thing. Because eventually you recover, and boom, you are stronger. Now we have a new 0, 0, which is up there. All right? So the way this frequency looks is going to be dependent on a lot of variables, such as gender. Women can usually handle more frequency because they can handle more volume. This is because women have more slow twitch fibers and are just not as tall generally, so they're not lifting the weight as far. And they're not quite as strong generally either, so it's going to be less taxing on the body. And I say like, usually, there are outliers, obviously. We're just going with means. Some movements, some muscle groups are going to have different SRA curves. So I'm just going to go through them all real quick because I think this is kind of helpful. So generally speaking, for most individuals, quadriceps are going to be best trained 2 to 3 times per week. Hamstrings, 1.5 to 2 times per week. I say 1.5 because maybe like 1 week you train them twice, the next week once, the next week twice, depending on how your training days fall. The hamstrings generally take a little bit of time to recover. They have a lot of fast twitch fibers. They can produce a lot of force. The chest for most individuals is probably going to be about 2 to 3 times per week. The back, probably 2 or so times per week for most individuals. Now this is where it gets fun. This is where the bros got it right. The arms, the delts, the abs can be trained 0 to 6 days. And then the arms and delts typically 2 to 6 times per week. Now the reason for this is those are smaller muscle groups. They fatigue really quickly, but then they also recover really quickly. It's like you do a boiling pot of water on the stove. If it's a small pot of water, it's going to heat up really quick, and it's going to cool down really quick. Whereas like the ocean takes a lot longer. So the biceps, triceps are smaller muscle groups. They fatigue quickly, they recover quickly, they can be trained with more frequency. Now, if you're doing really hard movements like squats, that SRA curve may look more like this. If you're doing curls, it's going to be more like this. That's also going to be effective based on how much volume you're doing in a given session. If you're like, I'm going to go do Rich Piana's 8-hour arm workout and just blast my arms into oblivion because, again, I want my friends to like me, so I need big arms. You might not be able to train them again for a very long time. Your SRA curve is going to be like the tortoise and the hare, but the tortoise got shot and never made it. All right? So that's literally what's going to happen to you if you do that arm workout. I did it. That's what happened to me. All right? So we want to train in a way where we can get enough frequency and quality sets in. If you do too many sets in a given workout, maybe the bottom tier sets are not going to actually be contributing to extra growth. That's considered junk volume. How do you know that you got enough sets? For bodybuilders, muscle building is very practical. Your pump is sick. Once you get that skin-splitting pump, you have arrived. That's probably enough for the day. If you start to notice a lot of irritation or the pump starts to dissipate, your arms start to get flaccid again, well, you probably did enough for that day. Save it for the next day. If you're doing a ton of back volume, that may affect the SRA curve for your bicep training because the back also works the biceps when you're doing your rows, your pull-ups and such. If you're doing a ton of chest volume, that's going to affect your tricep SRA curve and how much frequency you can get and vice versa. So look up muscle groups that kind of work together synergistically. If this is the block where your client wants to grow the wings and take off at O'Hare, tell them we're gonna chill a little bit on the bicep training maybe so that we can allocate that extra volume to their back because that back volume is gonna give them a lot of stimulus for their biceps. Something else to consider, we didn't really touch on this fully, but with the SRA curves, you're generally fresher earliest in the week. So going back to specificity, you probably wanna do what you care about most early in the week. And then within your training session too, you're gonna get the highest quality volume earlier in your training workout. So whatever you wanna do the most or build the most, you wanna do that earliest in the workout. That's why I never understood when strength coaches were like, Mike, you got to do your biceps at the end, you have to earn it. But I'm like, coach, biceps are all I want. So if he really knew who I was and he wanted to keep me as a client, should have done biceps first.
He just didn't want you to embarrass him, that's all.
Yeah, so that's that. But SRA curves, again, they're going to be affected by a myriad of variables. It's important to consider them all. If you notice that they're not recovering while going to the next session, but that's based on their schedule and how it works to train, you may want to back off a little bit in volume so that we can get through that entire whoop-de-doop. The more experience that they have training, maybe the more quickly their SRA curves are going to go because they're going to recover quickly because they're very efficient with the movements.
Yeah.
Other things you want to add to SRA curves?
I realized we kind of skipped over, you touched on this for a second, but I think it's important when you're programming to keep in mind that with synergistic muscle groups, there's overlap in programming for volume. So for example, if somebody's doing a close grip bench press, that will contribute fatigue to triceps as well. So I think it's when you're talking about working sets per week, to keep that in mind that there's obviously overlap with certain movements that contribute to fatigue to other muscle groups. So you can explain that to your client too. Maybe they're saying I'm not doing any direct tricep work, but they are indirectly with the close grip bench press, for example. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Correct. And then that's very important when you discuss which training days go where in the week. So
Yeah.
let's say they really want to build their squat. You do not probably want to do abs the day before squats.
Right.
Now the reason you want to do that is now your axial system's fatigued, they're not going to be able to handle as much load, now their quadriceps are going to be pissed at their abs because their quads didn't get the work they deserve because the abs failed first.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's why maybe abs, they generally for a lot of individuals go best at the end of a leg day, because then by the time you train legs again, your abs are not going to destroy your leg day.
So goals, the client's goals are really going to dictate what you prioritize in the training block, in the week, and in the session.
Correct.
So just stay true to that.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be perfect, and it may be somebody who wants to get bigger arms. So prioritize that. That's okay. Right.
It's not a sin to want big arms. We're socialized to be against it, but it's fine.
Yeah, you can break traditional strength and conditioning rules where it's whatever, but just keep that in mind.
Can I chime in on something?
Yes.
I would say I've even learned more about this recently just from training with Mike and like how we structure the workouts that we do together, of like what we're targeting and things. So yeah, I know it's adorable. We hug each other too.
I know.
But like in all
Part of your
seriousness, like
recovery.
yeah, like in all seriousness, like I've
Exactly.
been training for longer than most of the people here, but I'm still learning. So like I appreciate that and just like a refresher on how I can be better for other people too. So like this stuff has helped me personally be like more adaptable to and like bringing things together from like other sources. So little shout out to you, but
Oh,
and
thank
just
you.
some evidential like reasoning behind all this. Like it's helped not only my personal training, but me be an even better coach just from working with other people who are like-minded. So
Yeah, well, the feeling's mutual, so thank you.
we'll hug later.
Yeah, we will.
Are you guys gonna do it? Should do something?
We're starting the block, so we're trying to keep
How are we
fatigue
doing on
down
time?
right
We gotta
now.
keep arousal down.
No,
Yeah, we're
it's
trying
We
to
can
keep
get through
arousal
these next
down.
ones quick.
Got it. Cool.
Alrighty,
15 minutes?
we're almost there.
10 minutes. Let's get through these quick.
20 minutes. All right.
What, 3 minutes?
We got time. All right, so variation. All right, so we talked about, he touched on it. Directed adaptation says if you want to get great at anything, you must do it over time. But the law of accommodation is what is in constant conflict. It's like yin yang. Law of accommodation says if you do something for too long, you get diminishing returns. So that's where variation comes in. So variation, you want it to still build into the goals which they have. Typically, variation can look different in a number of ways. So we'll get into this with phase potentiation. It actually kind of like builds into phase potentiation. So we'll just put them together. Phase potentiation means to amplify. You want one phase of training, one block of training to build in or amplify the effects of the next. All right, and then you use variation within that context going from block to block. You can get variation not just from different movements. You go on social media and it's like, holy crap, like we're gonna go from squats to like a kettlebell overhead. Like that doesn't make sense to me because again, there's too much of a language gap between those. They don't build into the other well at all. You can get variation from training in a different rep range from one block to the next. So I like, and Juggernaut talks about this, it's the pendulum effect of Western periodization, where maybe one block with most of your movements, you're training them in a higher rep range, compound movements, maybe 6 to 12, accessories, 15 to 30. Then maybe the next block of training, you get variation by keeping a lot of the movements the same, but instead you're training the compound in like a 4 to 8 rep range, and then the subsequent like accessories in like a 10 to 15 range. So variation of rep range. You also can get variation, and the variation of rep range will play into variation of intensity because you're lifting a different weight to fit the context of that rep range. Variation could also be very small, but enough to tax different tissues. So for example, maybe one block you do a bench press. Now at the end of the block, you might have a lot of local fatigue here, and even though you did the deload, it still might be stale going into the next block. And that's where you get a variation of maybe the next block moving the hands in 2.5 inches, 2 inches on each hand. And that's enough of a variation so that you can keep making adaptation, but not too much that it's completely different from what you were building from previously. So you want each block to build into the next in a logical way, because that helps feed into the most important principle of specificity, where we're not trying to learn completely different skills each block. And then variation allows you to tax the fiber a little bit different maybe portions of the musculature as well. So that keeps local fatigue at bay, and it keeps you from hitting your MRV too quickly because your tissue has already been overworked from the previous block. What else do you want to add there?
That's good for variation phase. Yeah, phase potentiation just means you're basically setting your client up for success in the next phase. You want to be you don't want to have too much variation, unless there's like a crazy injury or something like that, or really drastic change in goals.
Correct.
Which could potentially happen, but more than likely you're just trying to string all the training blocks together in a logical way that each time sets them up for more success, and it just keeps building.
Yeah, and then it's also nice for psychological
Yeah.
reasons as well. It's new, and because it's kind of new, they're able to make those newbie gains again. So you deload, use phase potentiation, so you constantly get newbie gains,
Yep.
and that helps combat against the law of accommodation that says you do something for too long, you get diminishing. Variation also ties into the final, or one of the last principles here, being individual differences.
Yep.
So you may want to choose variations or utilize variations that fit the anthropometry
Yep.
of each athlete, so their limb lengths, and how those limbs work together, and then also based on the weaknesses. So for example, if you're working with someone that wants to get their squat up and they're really weak out of the hole, you might want to utilize, it seems like common sense, but for some reason oftentimes it's not, maybe pause squats.
Yeah.
So you make them spend more time learning the positions where they are weakest. Maybe on a deadlift, they have a really hard time with the lockout, and it's because their back's too weak. So maybe you program in extra row volume or good morning volume. So movements that not only train the movement pattern where they're weak, but also the musculature that supports within that movement pattern.
Yeah.
So variations should be used to kind of, it's almost like the condiments that you put on top of the burger. You go to a restaurant, they may have a really, really good tasting burger, but that burger can be taken to another level. It can be amplified itself based on the condiments you put on top. You choose the right accessories, the right condiments, and the right rep ranges, the right volume thresholds with the right SRA curves. Now all of a sudden that burger's gonna taste a lot better. AK, they're gonna be a lot stronger on their main stuff or whatever they wanna be great at. Individual differences, yeah, so it's, again, it's just pretty much based on the age of the athlete, the sex or gender of the athlete. Women handle more volume. A newbie athlete may not need as much volume to create change. So making sure that we're kind of playing all these principles within the context of that person. Some people may work a very stressful job. That's an individual difference that's going to affect every other principle and how you go about thinking about this. Some people are genetic freaks. I'm pretty sure if you gave Larry Wheels a grocery list and you said, all right, that's your workout, he would probably get stronger from it. So there's some people that are just like anomalies as well, and that's okay.
Yes.
Specific to individual differences, what separates a good coach from an excellent coach?
So several things. A good coach to an excellent, so a good coach can utilize specificity, progressive overload, fatigue management, and build some general strength, and their client gets some success. An excellent coach can watch an athlete, see what areas they're weak, not make this like weird like squat U like diagnosis where all of a sudden they're like doing all this random stuff and like cutting out all the weight they're lifting, but making small tweaks in volume, intensity, maybe selective variations later on to help kind of mediate and amplify the athlete's performance based on what they need.
And what if it's an external thing that is affecting their training?
So if it's an external thing, our goal is to, we're not therapists, we're not psychologists, so it's important to realize that. But I think a really important thing is listening to the athlete. So this is another this is actually a great point. Every person we work with, not only are they gonna have different limb lengths and all those other things that they really can't control, but they're also gonna have different personalities. So being able to inspire and motivate and get the best outcome out of the athlete, making them the happiest, is you're gonna wanna almost camouflage or become like that person. And that's where this principle, even though we put it at the bottom, may be the most important in some ways, because this creates the life expectancy as far as your engagement with that person. So if you're training a high school girl, maybe you discuss the Kardashians. You keep it fun. You talk about the things that they like. If you're training like someone that's like a very high-end businessman, they want to like really learn the science of what you're doing. Maybe you start getting a little bit more scientific. You discuss the why and the methodology behind what you're doing. If you're training like an extreme extrovert that like feasts on arousal and arousal doesn't fatigue them too much, maybe you play into that. I'm not saying get coked up with them, but put on the coked up music, you know? Like give them the jungle shot, let's go, like start yelling at them. Maybe you're training with the librarian that's quiet and like you do that, she's gonna slap you. You're peaceful. You talk in like slow, you literally slow your voice down. You talk in a deeper voice. You want to match pitch, you want to match body language, you want to match the way they look at you, and then read their facial expressions when they're doing things. Constantly analyzing, not only them from the movement standpoint, but also from the emotional standpoint. And match their energy, match them as a person, and become into what they like. And I guarantee it'll make it more fun for you as well as them. And you may learn things that you never would have learned about before. Like I've learned so much about the Kardashians and other aspects of stuff I would never normally touch on. But you know what? Like, that's pretty dope. I've learned a lot about Minecraft and video games. It's pretty cool when you see people. It's cool seeing people talking passionately about the things they're passionate about, and then you bring it back to the training. But there's that balance, and the individual difference of personality is what really allows someone to be successful as far as being able to coach and handle anyone and make anyone feel like they're your only client, your best friend, and that you have their best interest always in mind.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah.
And then probably the last one. So the last principle is missed fallacies, and then what we also added in, this isn't in the book, but periodization for various sports. So depending on where the athlete is, like, so we're gonna be working with a lot of high school athletes, we already do, college athletes. Their volume thresholds, what they should be focusing on as far as their training is gonna look different, whether they're going into season 3 months out, or whether they're currently in season. So that's important to take into account because that's going to affect their SRA curves, how much volume that they can handle. If an athlete is a basketball player and they are in season, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do a ton of plyos with them because they're already getting a ton of plyos from the sport itself. So maybe more so trying to get maintenance strength, maintaining the tissue that allows them to support their joints. So maintenance squats, maintenance RDLs, and keeping the volume rather low. And then also periodizing or programming based on games. If you know their games are on Friday and Saturdays, maybe you do their harder training on Monday and Tuesdays and like an easier day on Wednesday. And then you want to be maybe, again, low fatigue. If they're far away from sport, you can go into more of a general physical preparedness block where you're focusing on more variations, a little bit less specific, trying to, of course, build their ability to produce force. As the more muscle and force an athlete can produce, the more that's going to transfer to speed, acceleration, and power on the field, the more they're going to win. So further out, you may want to focus on muscle building, strength building, and pushing the envelope a little bit because you're not competing with the sport itself in terms of generating fatigue. If they're 4 weeks, if they're like 4 months out from the way I would do it for like a basketball player, 4 months out, most basketball players could stand to gain a little bit more lean tissue. Generally speaking, they're usually pretty skinny, maybe a higher risk of injury because they're just not that strong for how elastic and explosive they are. So do a block of hypertrophy. Now we're 3 months out, maybe have the block be more hypertrophy strength. 2 months out, more strength. And then 1 out, more maintenance strength and power. And then power is, of course, involved in every one of those blocks. But power would probably be the least involved, I would say, in season, because everything they do within their sports can be power. So thinking about the sport, thinking about the systems that are taxed, because that's exercise too, and that's going to affect a tennis player. If they're playing a ton of games, they're going to be using their side delt a ton, as well as their obliques and their transverse abdominis. So making sure that you do things that maybe help to maintain strength there, but not too much that those systems are fatigued when they're playing the sport itself. Injuries occur when you exceed tissue capacity. If you do too many overlying things that they're already doing in their sport, you have a higher risk of that and a higher risk of injury. Strength training is meant to decrease risk.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add for periodization for various sports?
Well, I mean, I think this goes back to phase potentiation. So just the way that I do this a lot of times is I'll start out with hypertrophy, and then I'll go to hypertrophy strength, then I'll go to strength power, and then once they get to in season, I go to maintenance. And the way you can explain this to them, or athletes, let's say, is like you've built muscle tissue, now you're gonna get the muscle tissue strong, and then you're gonna get the muscle tissue powerful, explosive, and coordinated. And then they enter like a maintenance phase in season where you're just like Mike said, is you're maintaining strength, trying to limit soreness, so reducing volume, and trying to like avoid injury, obviously.
Correct. And then with like power, again, you can train it like through every phase because there's more things that an athlete has to be great at than powerlifting, obviously.
Right.
And then when you're involving power and hypertrophy, how do you do the two? I would generally do their power stuff first, and then the hypertrophy, just because power stuff comes with a lower fatigue cost than hypertrophy would.
Yeah.
Power is gonna be like mostly neural and being able to exhibit force very quickly. But as far as the muscular system being taxed, it allows the muscular system to express itself, but it does not dismantle or fatigue the muscular system a whole lot. But there is a lot of force on the joints. And with that, if you do a ton of hypertrophy, you're really fatigued, and then you try to jump, A, you're not gonna be getting a progressive overload because you're gonna be glued to the ground. But B, trying to land and do other things where your musculature that supports those joints is already fatigued can sometimes be a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
So think about what hurts the other more and try to pair it based on what the athlete needs in a way that is logical.
And that goes back to the specificity.
Yes, all goes back to specificity. And then I guess a couple myths that we could touch on. One of our favorite ones that you're gonna hear, so these are pushbacks that you're gonna get from clients. One is sometimes women, not to be sexist, but sometimes women are afraid of weight training making them bulky. Now there's a million analogies you can use, we've all seen it. One that I like is just because you got your driver's license doesn't mean you're going to win NASCAR races. What you can explain to them is building lean tissue will have a positive effect on their metabolic health. They're going to burn slightly more calories every day. It's an investment in that. People that weight train, the literature is quite convincing. They are the ones that more easily lose body fat, but they're also the ones that more easily keep body fat off. Out of the people that regain weight after losing it, only 30% of those individuals that regain actually do any type of strength training. So you can use weight training as a tool to point it back to maybe what their goal may be. Always listening to the client's goal and making sure that they understand why you're doing it. Because most people are logical when they understand that weight training won't make them bulky, it's gonna make them look more toned, and burn more calories and have a lower risk of cancer and other various diseases. That's usually where people get on board. Plus, it's very healthy for a lot of individuals to focus on those numbers going up instead of their body weight. So it allows for a shift in mindset, which can be really nice for a lot of people. Another myth that's very common is the cardio myth. So cardio is great for metabolic health, but when it comes to weight loss and fat loss, it is not like the fountain of youth. This is not like the biggest thing in the world. So cardio serves a purpose for most individuals. If you're performing in cardio, you're doing marathons, that's one thing. You then want to make sure that your periodization as far as the cardio is concerned is very important and kind of directed towards that. But the myth that sometimes gets supported is you have to do cardio to lose a lot of body fat. So when I utilize cardio for individuals that are using it with the sole purpose of decreasing body fat, we try to use modalities that are the least disruptive to their weight training. So if you do a crap ton of running, you might burn a couple hundred calories running, but now if your squat volume, your squat strength sucks, well, guess what? You're gonna probably build less lean tissue, you're gonna burn less calories in that avenue, and you're gonna set yourself up for a risk of muscle loss and maybe not even fat loss. So we wanna use cardio for people that wanna burn excess calories in a way where we use the least disruptive way possible. This is most easily attained via tracking steps. Most individuals can increase their step output. Most people just don't move enough. Finding ways to increase their non-exercise activity thermogenesis, that's gonna be the name of the game. Things that I enjoy, I like walking on an inclined treadmill, but just being careful of periodizing the dose accordingly so that doesn't generate too much fatigue. If people love cardio because it makes them feel great, just make sure that maybe you don't do a really hard run the day before a squat day. So again, that goes back to the SRA curves. But cardio is not 100% needed for fat loss. It is helpful. It also helps to regulate appetite, keep ghrelin suppressed slightly, and it alleviates mood. And people that have a good mood sometimes will be less likely to stress eat. So there is that benefit, but dosing it appropriately. There was a cool study that was just published looking at people that train 6 days per week. One group did strength training 6 days per week. One group did strength training and cardio 3 and 3, and the other group did cardio 6 times per week. The group that did just weight training 6 days per week actually lost the most body fat and retained the most lean mass, whereas the group that just did the cardio lost the least amount of body fat and lost the most lean tissue. The group that did a mixture of the two was great. Like the 3 and 3 was essentially the same as the 6 times weight training per week. So making sure that the dosaging makes sense. Cardio's not good, cardio's not bad, but just making sure you understand its purpose for the directed adaptations which the individual wants and program accordingly is very important. Any other myths that we want to touch on?
I think that's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Nicely done.